All right. When news breaks around the NBA and it involves the Brooklyn Nets, a little bit of Kyrie Irving, we want to get on and talk with maybe the victims of the circumstance, depending on how it unfolds here. Brian Kamenetzky, obviously from the Locked On Lakers podcast, we've connected over the course of this offseason, and it just felt too juicy, too easy to tee one up and ask you the question of, in theory, Shams Charania reports that things have again reached a standstill between the Nets and Kyrie Irving from a contract standpoint, and now opens the
Mhm.
door. Lakers, the Knicks, even I think the Clippers thrown in later in the news cycle as far as potential landing spots for Kyrie. But let's start at the high end of it. How desperate are you to get this guy onto your roster with LeBron James?
Oh, I mean, like you just talk about a guy who is a perfect fit, a model guy, a plug and play guy for the next 5 years, where you just get Kyrie and you put your head on the pillow and you get some
You go
comfortable night's sleep, because like what could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong with adding Kyrie Irving? You know what? I think particularly if you can lock him up
yeah.
for the longest possible time at the biggest possible money, so everybody is happy and comfortable going forward. I can see no downside whatsoever to this idea for the Lakers.
When I signed Kyrie Irving, I put my head on that pillow and I think
Oh,
sweet dreams, baby, all night
that's
long.
right.
How the one thing is, and I think a lot of people share that sentiment around God, how can you be committed to Kyrie Irving? It's what the Nets are facing right now. The fact that the Lakers come up in this though, how
Mhm.
desperate are the Lakers? Because you and I have we connected over this offseason just around the state of our two franchises. Things didn't go according to plan. It's the back end of LeBron James' career. Is that what this is? That the Lakers, maybe unlike the Nets, who are saying if it
Mhm.
starts to fall apart, it starts to fall apart now. The Lakers are unwilling to let go of that with LeBron and obviously with Anthony Davis there too.
That's the huge question. And it's funny, like for Monday, Andy and I did, we Kevin O'Connor was on his podcast talking about potential interest from the Lakers in Bradley Beal. We have no idea if that's mutual. I'm fairly sure it isn't. But just the concept of talking about extending somebody like Brad Beal, who's had some injury issues, and all that, but is otherwise an excellent player, not as good as I think is potentially dominant as Kyrie, but an excellent player. Um, Sorry about that. But see, but you have to worry about the injuries. You have to worry about all this other stuff. And he's a model citizen. Like he's a great guy, great locker room player, great guy in the community, all these other things. And while Kyrie certainly does a lot of things for the community, you want to talk about a guy's impact in the locker room and impact on the franchise and all that. It is like dropping a time bomb into your organization. It's Russell Westbrook on steroids. The difference is Kyrie is still really good. And so
Mm.
you have to balance that thing for all of his weirdness and flakiness, and I think general ambivalence about being a full-time basketball player. Um, he's still excellent when he
Yeah.
plays. And
Yep.
so I think that's the thing you have to try to figure out. And I I think that is the temptation for the Lakers. Like, what if we could add Kyrie? They are still that team until proven otherwise that will always try to add the star if that's the option.
That being the case, because you mentioned Westbrook as well. The one thing I find interesting is this news breaks, and all of a sudden, there's a couple of teams that could be vying for Kyrie. Now,
Mhm.
those teams don't have the financial freedom to just go out and sign Kyrie outright in free agency. So then it becomes the mechanics of it. And I do think about it from a Nets perspective of, okay, so how do you keep yourself involved in the dance, right? How do you, just like with James Harden, how do you try to get some value out of this thing? How far do you think the Lakers would be willing to go if it has to be facilitated through a sign and trade, understanding the numbers there? Now, I'll
Mhm.
live in the reality. Nets would probably have to maybe accept the idea of taking a player option of Russell Westbrook for a year, to make that money work. But asset wise, right? Talent wise, what are the Lakers willing to sacrifice for this maybe small 2-year window or something that they think they could get another championship for LeBron?
That's the aspect. First of all, it would have to be for Russell Westbrook. There is literally no other way the Lake, other than Anthony Davis and LeBron James, which is not going to happen.
Which, by the way, if I can just tell Nets fans right now, shut up. And I'm not saying anyone is, is suggesting it, but if you think there's this world where you get back Anthony Davis or the like, right? Like, it's not happening. You're going to have to take Russell Westbrook, and then what else can you get?
We are down here in Los Angeles on AD. Lakers fans are worried. They're a little pessimistic. They feel like we're not that down.
Right.
We're not that negative. We're not that pessimistic about Anthony Davis. So we're like, you know what? Kyrie Irving. Okay. Yeah. So that's not, it would have to be for Russ. Probably Russ and something. But, the Lakers have a couple first round picks that they might be able to throw in with protection or whatever. The biggest question is, what would Kyrie take for a sign and trade? Would he demand on a full, I guess from the Lakers, it would be 4 years. I actually don't think the Lakers would commit to 4 years to Kyrie.
Right. If
he opted in, would they trade Russell Westbrook for Kyrie for this year and just see what happens? My understanding of that, the hard capping and all that kind of stuff would hamstring the Lakers a little bit. That I think, but if they could work the money around, that I think they would do, because functionally Kyrie would work better in this group than Westbrook would. And I think like the Westbrook situation is, just as much as Darvin Ham is trying to play him up and on, it's not a good setup and it's not a good situation. And the chances are it's not going to turn out well. I think you would trade that for a year of Kyrie Irving and see what happens. I think the Lakers would even be willing to go a year plus one. Right. But would they be willing to do 4? I don't think so. And if the Lakers won't do it for the same reasons the Nets won't, right, I wonder who will. I mean, that's what's really tricky about this whole thing.
And that's something that Doug and I are going to be discussing a lot is this a mutual disconnect of not even about the money or the years, but there's a respect that's been lost between these two sides. And Kyrie saying, well, whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to go do it somewhere else. And that opens up the 1-and-1 on another team, right? It opens up some financial flexibility, as opposed to saying, no, I only want the max contract. Wherever I am, that's what I want. And that, to your point, that shuts down everybody. Like, I think that shuts down almost all viable landing spots outside of what we highlighted early in the offseason of, well, there's teams that can sign him outright in free agency if he opted out, and then he can hold him into the season and wait for, I think it'd be December at some point, October, December, I think, where they can then flip him in season and get that big haul. Maybe the mechanics of that are a little more favorable. It gets more draft capital for the Spurs, who would be able to do it financially, right? They can turn around and flip him. But these 1-to-1 moves, I tell
you what, nobody screams Spurs culture like Kyrie Irving.
And even that, right? Like, I think even a team out there that would say, we'll take him and we'll hold on to him for now. I do wonder about, do you even want that aspect of it? Because you're taking a flyer on if his value exists later on. And that's why when I said about, okay, what's the assets? The Lakers have some future first round picks, and obviously the Nets will be interested in that. In looking over at the funny thing is too, especially in this scenario, the Nets don't have any other contracts to send back to make sure the money works and lines up here. The Lakers don't have any players really under contract. The only guy that I pointed to would be Talen Horton-Tucker, saying, well, the trade exemption that the Nets occupy from James Harden could be utilized there.
Yeah, and they can, for Nets fans, it's Talen Horton-Tucker at about $11 million, Kendrick Nunn, who hasn't officially opted into next year, but will for $5 million. That's it. Everybody else is a max guy or a minimum guy. So that's all the Lakers have.
And that's the scenario. I guess we can get out of here just on this. In the world where it goes down and the Nets say, hey, we'll eat the money on the 1 year for assuming Russell Westbrook accepts the idea of going to the player option and taking his money, which would seem to be logical for him. But we'll take Russell Westbrook off your hands. Are you giving up multiple first round picks? I ran it through a trade machine. 2023 second rounder, 2026 first rounder, 2028 first rounder, and Horton-Tucker to get back.
Kyrie.
Yeah, for Kyrie Irving. And let's assume that it's the ideal scenario of the 1-and-1 opportunity or whatever it may look like, right? A more friendly position for the Lakers to be in as opposed to the max contract.
it's a catch-22 because on the one hand, the problem with this is if it works for a year, are you willing to say it'll work for 2? If it works for 2, are you willing to say it'll work for 4? And at some point, you're constantly on this treadmill. It's bad enough to be on it with LeBron, where you're on this like year-to-year kind of treadmill. The Lakers are hoping, I believe, to extend him for 2 more years so that they have some certainty around LeBron. I just don't know if you ever feel comfortable with Kyrie, because even the stuff around the vaccination aside, most of the reporting I've seen, most of the stuff I've read, people you talk to, it's not just the vaccine thing. If it's not the vaccine thing, it's something else. If it's not that thing, it's another thing. And ultimately it comes down to how much basketball does he really want to play over 82 games. There are a few players who are as impactful as he is, but the big lesson for the Lakers is the chemistry matters, the mix matters. That's what we learned last season. We could call it last season now. And I just don't think they would be willing to pull the trigger on something for Kyrie if it means having to give up the few assets that they have, because then how do you undo it? And you almost put yourself on a situation where you are forced to commit longer term to Kyrie than anybody should possibly feel comfortable with. Never say never. There may be a way to construct something with third teams or whatever that, and just who knows? Maybe Kyrie has a really good conversation with Darvin Ham and Rob Pelinka. But I'd be skeptical. Brad Beal, I'd have worries about contract. I'd have worries about the money. I'd have other concerns about injuries, whatever. I would not have concerns about culture. Kyrie brings culture concerns, and that is a big problem.
Yep. And as of this moment right now, you would say every team that Kyrie has been on, the most recent team has always suffered greatest, right? Mm-hmm. From the Cavs to Boston to Brooklyn, the team that has him last has suffered the most because of his presence on that team, whatever version of that is.
You know what we haven't mentioned? Do we know LeBron wants to play with Kyrie again?
Well, by the way, right, for all of that, and Kyrie came out and said, hey, I was younger and I learned my lesson and I wanted to strike out on my own, but I apologize to LeBron. Okay, that's fine. Whatever LeBron brings to the table and whatever control he has over an organization, so you could argue rightfully so, the bottom line is he's always that guy when it comes to basketball, right? And I think that's that idea of respect that players genuinely seem to have for Kyrie around the league. But the interest of wanting to play with him, though, I respect you, right? I respect you as a player and as a person. Doesn't mean that I want to have to maybe deal with everything that comes along with you being on my roster. And I think maybe Kevin Durant's experiencing that right now. So, hey, man, I won't tell you what the Nets or what I'd be willing to take from the Lakers in order to get Kyrie off the roster.
Russell Westbrook, straight up, boom, your problem from our problem. That the Lakers would do. They'd take a flyer on a year of Kyrie. But I don't know.
Very interesting to think of. It's like, would that and Horton Tucker and some lesser picks be enough for the Nets, who maybe are already thinking about resetting their timeline here around Kevin Durant, what he has left? That being the case, the offseason is long, and we will be connecting with Brian and, of course, Andy. You can bring him along next time if you'd like. Over the course of this, lot to talk around, obviously around the NBA, the Lakers and Nets specifically. Appreciate a few minutes to break down what is the impending trade for the Lakers and Kyrie Irving.